At 11:47 in the evening, CEO Evelyn Blackthorne tore Nolan Reed's safety report in half and fired him inside the operations center, calling the single father a maintenance engineer obstructing the company's largest aircraft deal. Nolan left the hangar without argument, pausing only long enough to say, "Don't let it fly." 20 minutes later, in Geneva, billionaire Conrad Blackthorne received an encrypted alert and immediately ended his meeting with international investors. He ordered his private jet prepared and flew straight back to the United States because his granddaughter had just dismissed the one man capable of saving the Blackthorne Aviation empire from itself. If this story moved you, subscribe to this channel and stay close, because the next one is already on its way. Blackthorne Aviation had spent 4 years and more than $900 million building the Vantage 900, a long-range private aircraft designed to carry executives and heads of state across continents in silence and comfort. The demonstration flight was scheduled for 7 the following morning at Greyhaven Field, a private airstrip owned by the company 30 miles outside the city, and the guest list read like a directory of the aerospace world's most powerful decision-makers. More than 100 investors, airline procurement directors, and federal safety regulators had already checked into the resort hotel 2 miles from the runway, where Blackthorne's communications team had arranged a champagne breakfast and a live audio feed from the cockpit. If the demonstration succeeded, Evelyn would sign a contract worth $6.2 billion before noon, the largest single deal in the company's 60-year history, and she would do it on camera in front of every person who had ever whispered that she was too young, too untested, or too much her grandfather's idea of a successor rather than one forged from her own decisions. The pressure was not lost on anyone in the executive suite, and by 10 that evening the guest pavilion was still lit with conversation and polished glasses while caterers arranged centerpieces and the communications director rehearsed the morning's talking points. Nolan Reed was not in the pavilion. He was 2 levels below the main floor of Hangar 14, working beneath the Vantage 900's left wing with a diagnostic tablet braced against his knee, cross-referencing hydraulic pressure logs against the temperature data recorded over the previous 18 hours. He wore the same Navy work uniform he had worn every night shift for the better part of 2 decades, the kind with a name patch that had faded enough to be difficult to read in low light, and his tools were organized with the quiet precision of someone who had long since stopped needing to think about where anything was. The 3 anomalies he had flagged first appeared in a cold-weather simulation run the previous week, brief drops in the backup hydraulic circuit, each lasting no more than 4 seconds, short enough that the aircraft's software had categorized them as data noise and closed the alert without escalation. Nolan did not treat them as noise. He pulled the serial number from the pressure sensor at the junction of the secondary circuit and ran it against the company's approved vendor registry. And what he found stopped him mid-breath. The component did not match any number on the list. It had been sourced from a supplier that Blackthorne Aviation had never certified, never audited, and never authorized for flight-critical systems. He documented everything methodically, attached the sensor data to a formal report, and then walked it upstairs to find the one person who had the operational authority to ground the aircraft. Grant Vail found him first. The chief operating officer arrived in the hangar, dressed in the kind of suit that cost more than most engineers earned in a month, flanked by 2 members of the technical compliance team who both looked like they had been pulled away from the pavilion and were unhappy about it. Grant did not read the report. He set it on the nearest workbench, glanced at the first page long enough to understand its conclusion, and then told Nolan in a flat and businesslike tone to close the file, sign the pre-flight clearance, and go home. Grant reminded him, with the particular patience of someone who had long practice at speaking to subordinates without quite insulting them directly, that a night shift engineer's role in a demonstration of this scale was to confirm that the aircraft met checklist standards, not to author new theories about hardware provenance at midnight. Nolan listened to all of it without expression, set the report back on the bench with the sensor data facing up, and told Grant that he would not sign a clearance for an aircraft with an uncertified pressure sensor in its backup hydraulic circuit, and that he was formally requesting a 48-hour delay so the component could be removed, identified, and replaced. The silence that followed lasted long enough that one of the compliance team members shifted his weight and looked at the floor. Grant's tone did not change, but something behind his eyes did, and he said that Nolan should think very carefully about whether a night shift position was really the platform from which he wanted to make this kind of stand. Nolan said he was not making a stand. He said the aircraft did not know the difference between a billionaire and a mechanic, and that when a system failed at altitude, it failed for everyone on board the same way. Grant picked up the report, tucked it under his arm without another word, and went upstairs to find the CEO. Evelyn Blackthorne had been told she was leaving the investor dinner to deal with a disruptive employee, which meant she walked into the operations center already prepared to be frustrated. She was 37 years old and had been running Blackthorne Aviation for 3 years, long enough to have memorized every version of the argument that the company moved too fast, cut too many corners, or promoted the wrong kind of ambition, and short enough that she still heard those arguments with a personal edge she had not yet learned to process as ordinary friction. When she stepped through the operations center door and saw Nolan standing between the senior managers in his faded uniform with a grease smudge along one forearm, her first impression was so thoroughly shaped by what he looked like rather than what he had found that she spent the opening 30 seconds of the conversation in entirely the wrong frame of mind. She asked Grant to summarize the issue, listen to his version of events, which described a cautious technician who had mistaken a simulation artifact for a structural defect, and then turned to Nolan and asked him to explain the problem in plain language, not engineering language, because the morning was in 9 hours and she did not have time for a seminar. Nolan explained it in plain language. He said the pressure sensor controlling the backup hydraulic circuit did not come from an approved vendor, that the data showed it behaved incorrectly below a temperature threshold that Greyhaven Field had reached the previous night, and that in the specific conditions forecast for the next morning, cold ground temperature followed by rapid climb into dry crosswind air, the aircraft's computer might misread the sensor signal and isolate the backup hydraulic circuit as damaged. He said the main circuit would still function, but with reduced redundancy, which in a demonstration flight profile involving a series of banked turns and a low-altitude pass meant the flight crew would be managing an aircraft with less control authority than its certification assumed. He said he could not prove beyond certainty that the flight would fail, but that he also could not certify that it was safe, and that the difference between those two statements was exactly why the delay was necessary. Evelyn asked him a direct question. Was he certain with engineering certainty that the flight would be dangerous? Nolan said no. He said he was certain of the sensor data, certain of the temperature readings, and certain that the scenario he described was physically possible, but he could not offer her a guarantee about what would happen because aeronautical engineering did not work on guarantees. It worked on probability, and right now the probability was unacceptable. Evelyn said that vague probability was not a basis for halting a $6.2 billion contract the night before it was scheduled to close. She said that people in Nolan's position were hired to confirm aircraft met standards, not to hold the company's most important deals hostage to hypotheticals they couldn't prove. Grant stood slightly behind her left shoulder and said nothing, which was a kind of speaking in itself. Evelyn told the room, with a clarity that she believed was authority, and that Nolan recognized as something else, that engineers who worked maintenance shifts did not have the organizational standing to instruct the Blackthorne family on how to run their company. Nolan did not respond to the insult. He picked up the report from the table where Grant had set it, turned to the last page, and asked Evelyn to read the note at the bottom before she made a final decision. Grant stepped forward almost immediately and placed himself between Evelyn and the document, a move that was quick enough to look like helpfulness and deliberate enough that Nolan saw exactly what it was. The report stayed on the table, closed. Grant made his recommendation in private, in the narrow corridor outside the operations center, while two of the directors lingered close enough to hear without appearing to listen. He told Evelyn that Nolan had been passed over for a promotion 18 months earlier, and that this kind of late-night obstruction was consistent with an employee who felt undervalued and was using a routine technical concern as leverage. He said that if Nolan was allowed to walk out of the building tonight with a signed delay request, he would be at the Federal Aviation Administration's regional office before sunrise with a formal complaint, and that by 6 in the morning, the guest list for the demonstration would be receiving calls from journalists, not from Blackthorne's communications team. He told her that the fastest and cleanest solution was to terminate Nolan's employment immediately, collect his credentials, and have security escort him off the property before he could make any outside contact. Evelyn listened with the focused stillness of someone processing information under time pressure, and when Grant finished, she stood quiet for a moment, in a way that might have led somewhere different if she had asked a single additional question. She asked Nolan to come back into the operations center. She told him, with the deliberate formality of someone delivering a prepared statement, that she was giving him one final opportunity to sign the pre-flight clearance and classify the sensor anomaly as within acceptable tolerances. She said that if he refused, she would interpret his refusal as insubordination and would act accordingly. Nolan asked her to define accordingly. She told him it meant his contract with Blackthorne Aviation would end that night. Grant added, with a smile that did not reach his eyes, that a man in Nolan's financial situation, a single father with a daughter finishing her sophomore year, might want to consider very carefully before trading a senior engineering salary for a moral gesture no one outside that room would ever hear about. Nolan looked at Grant for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then he looked back at Evelyn. He said he was not protecting himself. He said there were people who would be sitting on that aircraft in the morning who had families waiting for them, the same as he did, and that his job was not to make the deal work. His job was to make sure the machine that carried those people was the machine it was supposed to be. Evelyn said that speech sounded like a man who had decided to make his refusal into a performance, and that she found it insulting that he would use other people's families as a shield for his own grievances. The words landed in the room and nobody spoke. Then Evelyn reached across the table, picked up the safety report, both pages, and tore it in half down the center fold. She told him his access was revoked, effective immediately. 2 security officers appeared at the door within 90 seconds, which told Nolan that Grant had prepared for this outcome before the conversation began. Nolan placed his identification badge on the table without being asked. He looked at Evelyn directly and said that she could fire him, but she could not adjust the laws of physics to fit her timeline. Then he walked with the security officers through the length of the hangar, past the Vantage 900 gleaming under the overhead lights, and out through the side exit into the cold. Before he reached the parking lot, he took out his phone and called Dean Holloway, the company's chief test pilot, and left a message when Dean did not pick up. Check the second hydraulic circuit before you move to the runway. Evelyn returned to the investor dinner and told the table that a minor personnel matter had been resolved. She had the communications director prepare an internal memo describing Nolan's separation as a disciplinary action resulting from conduct unbecoming a senior employee. She believed, and had every structural reason to believe, that the matter was closed. What she did not know was that when Nolan's personnel file was archived and his building access was deactivated, a system buried in Blackthorne Aviation's security architecture automatically generated an encrypted notification and routed it to a single private address in Geneva, Switzerland. Conrad Blackthorne had built the notification protocol himself 12 years earlier, during a period when he was stepping back from daily operations and needed to be certain that certain safeguards could not be quietly undone by whoever sat in the executive chair after him. The protocol was called the Founder's Red Key, and it named 3 specific employees out of more than 4,000, whose employment status, building access, and formal objections were classified as matters of direct concern to the founder. Nolan Reed was one of the 3. The protocol had never been triggered before tonight. Conrad was in the middle of a structured presentation to a sovereign wealth fund when his personal assistant placed a tablet on the table beside him, face up, with 3 lines of text visible on the screen. Nolan Reed terminated. Safety report, archived without review. Vantage 900 demonstration, proceeding as scheduled at 0700. Conrad read the 3 lines once. He excused himself from the room, walked into the corridor, and called Evelyn's number. The call went to a voicemail recording that told him she was unavailable and would return messages during business hours. Grant Vale, standing near the back of the pavilion with a glass of sparkling water and a conversation he was performing rather than having, felt the notification pulse on the secondary phone in his jacket pocket, the one tied to Evelyn's calendar permissions, and saw the incoming call from Conrad Blackthorne's private number. He dismissed the notification without answering it and moved slightly deeper into the room. Conrad called again. Grant dismissed it again. On the 3rd attempt, Conrad bypassed Evelyn's line entirely and called Marin Cole, the company's director of flight testing, who was not at the pavilion and who answered on the 2nd ring from a quiet corner of the hangar complex. Conrad asked her a single question: was the aircraft ready to fly? The pause before Marin answered told him more than the answer itself. She said the clearance had been signed. He said that was not what he had asked. She said, very quietly, that she had concerns she had not been able to put on record tonight. Conrad said he understood, thanked her, and ended the call. He told his assistant to prepare the jet for immediate departure. When the assistant asked whether it might be more practical to wait until morning and take a commercial connection, Conrad said that if Nolan Reed had allowed himself to be walked out of a hangar without resistance, it meant he had seen something serious enough that losing the job felt like the smaller risk. The flight from Geneva to the eastern United States took just under 9 hours, and Conrad Blackthorne spent most of it awake. He sat at the rear of the cabin with a glass of water and a folder of documents he was not reading, because what occupied his mind was a morning 12 years earlier when he had been a passenger on a prototype aircraft that was not ready to leave the ground. A morning when a young systems engineer had submitted a formal concern during the pre-flight review and been told, by people with better titles, that the schedule would proceed. Nolan Reed had been 30 years old when the aircraft encountered an uncommanded roll at 11,000 feet caused by a feedback error in the lateral control module. Exactly the scenario he had described in his written concern. It was Nolan's voice on the crew intercom that walked the pilot through the manual override sequence that the automated system had not been designed to handle. Conrad heard that voice from the passenger cabin, calm and specific and without panic, and it kept him in his seat rather than bracing against the bulkhead. The aircraft landed safely. 3 members of the test program management team left the company within the month, and Conrad incorporated Nolan's pre-flight notes into the company's safety review protocol under a new name that did not credit anyone in particular, because that was the kind of man Nolan was. He had not asked for credit, had not mentioned the incident in any subsequent meeting, and had returned to his workbench the following Monday, as though the week before had been unremarkable. Conrad had offered him a senior director role. Nolan had declined it. His wife had been ill for more than a year by then, and he told Conrad that he needed to remain in a role that kept him close to home and on a predictable schedule, and that he trusted Conrad to keep the company's safety culture strong without needing Nolan in a room full of executives to do it. When his wife died 2 years later, Nolan had come back from bereavement leave and asked for nothing. No adjustment to his role, no public acknowledgement, no special consideration, and had simply returned to the work. Conrad had quietly amended the company's governance charter to include the founder's red key within the same week, because he had realized that the most dangerous thing about Nolan Reed was not that he might leave the company. It was that someone with more authority might one day mistake his quietness for insignificance and act accordingly. What Conrad had failed to account for was that the next generation of Blackthorne leadership would never be told the full story of who Nolan Reed actually was, and that absence of knowledge would one day cost everyone very dearly. Nolan arrived home at 1:50 in the morning to a kitchen light left on, and a teenager who had fallen asleep on the couch with a textbook open across her chest. Harper was 15 and had her father's habit of positioning herself near whatever needed watching, and she woke when she heard his key in the lock with the immediate full consciousness of someone who had been not quite sleeping. She looked at him for a moment and said nothing, which was its own kind of question. Nolan sat in the chair across from her and told her without preamble that he had lost the job because he would not sign a document he did not believe was accurate. Harper asked if he was going to be okay. He told her he would find other work. She asked him if he regretted it. He looked at his hands for a moment, and then said that he could find another job. There would always be another job, but the people on that aircraft in the morning only had one chance to get home, and he could not have signed that document and remained the person she knew him to be. Harper did not say anything to that. She folded the textbook closed and went to bed, and Nolan sat in the kitchen until 4 in the morning before driving back to Greyhaven Field to collect the toolbox of personal instruments he had left in his locker. He arrived at the employee entrance at 6:15 to find that his badge no longer activated the reader, which meant he stood at the gate of a facility where he had worked for nearly 20 years and waited for a security officer to come outside and process his personal property request. Grant Vale appeared before the security officer did, walking out through the main entrance with 2 compliance managers on either side of him, and when he saw Nolan standing at the gate, he slowed his pace just enough to make the moment deliberate. He said, loudly enough for the technicians nearby to hear, that former employees were not permitted in restricted areas, and that if Nolan was hoping to retrieve anything more than a toolbox, he would find the legal department's answer had not changed overnight. He called him a bitter tradesman who had made a catastrophic miscalculation about his own importance. The technicians nearby did not look up, which was its own form of discomfort. Nolan asked, calmly, whether someone could bring his toolbox to the gate. Evelyn arrived 20 minutes later with a contingent of investors and their assistants, all wearing the same expression of well-rested anticipation that people wear when they believe a scheduled event will proceed and deliver what was promised. She saw Nolan at the gate and did not approach him. One of the investors asked a question, and she answered it without pause, which meant she was giving Nolan a very specific kind of dismissal, the kind that communicated not just that she had no interest in what he had to say, but that his presence at the gate was an embarrassment she intended to process by ignoring. A security officer appeared at Nolan's elbow and suggested that he wait by the parking structure while the toolbox was retrieved, and Nolan said quietly that he had something to tell the CEO about the temperature overnight. Evelyn, close enough to hear, said that the aircraft would fly whether he stood at the fence or not, and that she hoped he was prepared to live with having been wrong. Nolan said he was not rooting for her to fail. He said he was trying to stop the people on that aircraft from paying the price for a success built on the wrong foundation. The control tower announcement came at 6:54, 14 minutes before the demonstration was scheduled to begin. A Blackthorne private aircraft was requesting priority landing clearance, identifier Bravo Charlie 1, the code assigned to Conrad Blackthorne's personal jet, which had not been logged on any arrival manifest for the next 48 hours. The tower confirmed the approach, and the aircraft appeared on the eastern horizon, a clean horizontal profile resolving into the familiar silhouette of the Founder's Gulfstream as it descended toward the main runway. Nobody in the guest pavilion knew why it was there. The lead investor relations director made a brief phone call and then ended it with an expression that suggested she had not received the information she was hoping for. Evelyn walked out of the pavilion with 2 members of her senior team, and for a moment she allowed herself to believe this was an unexpected gift. Her grandfather arriving to witness the greatest deal in the company's history, and to stand beside her when she signed it. She had the reception line arranged on the tarmac within 3 minutes. 6 executives, camera crew, investor relations. Conrad's jet rolled to a stop and the door opened, and he descended the stairs with the particular deliberateness of a man who was not in a hurry because he had already decided what he was going to do. He was 71 years old and still carried the frame of someone who had spent decades walking factory floors and insisting on knowing how everything worked, and the morning light caught him at an angle that made him look, to the assembled investors, exactly like the kind of figure who appears in the final act of a story to settle what the earlier acts could not. He reached the bottom of the stairs, looked at the reception line, looked past it, and then looked toward the perimeter fence, where a man in a faded navy uniform was standing with a metal toolbox at his feet. Conrad walked toward the fence. He did not acknowledge the reception line, did not speak to Evelyn, did not look at the cameras. He reached the gate, examined the electronic lock for approximately 2 seconds, and then used his personal override key to disengage it, a key that, Evelyn would later learn, existed in the company charter under the same governance provision that had triggered the notification in Geneva. He pushed the gate open, walked through, and extended his hand to Nolan Reed. The investors watched in complete silence. Evelyn's expression moved through several stages in rapid succession, none of them entirely controlled. The first question Conrad asked was not about the contract, not about the morning's schedule, and not about any person standing in the reception line. He asked Nolan what the aircraft had. Nolan described the sensor, the temperature threshold, and the hydraulic isolation scenario in 4 sentences. Conrad absorbed it without interrupting. Then he turned to Evelyn and asked her, with a quietness that was somehow more demanding than volume, whether she had read the safety report before terminating the engineer who wrote it. Evelyn said the report had been reviewed by the technical compliance team. Conrad asked again, more specifically, whether she had personally read it. The silence was its own answer. He looked at the aircraft sitting at the far end of the taxiway and said, he had not flown more than 7,000 miles to restore a man's employment status. He had flown back to correct the decision that made the flight necessary. Grantvale said, from a position slightly behind Evelyn, that Nolan's credentials had been formally revoked and that he had no standing in the morning's operational chain. Conrad removed a laminated card from the inside pocket of his jacket, handed it to the security director, and said that the Founder's red key was now in effect, that Nolan Reed's access was reinstated, and that Nolan was to be given full authority over the disposition of the demonstration flight, including the power to suspend it without CEO approval, without board approval, and without discussion. The security director looked at the card, looked at Evelyn, and then began typing into his tablet. The Vantage 900's engines were already turning. Dean Holloway had received Nolan's voicemail at 2 in the morning and had spent the hours before dawn trying to decide what to do with it. He had flown with Nolan's assessments for 11 years and had never found one that was wrong in the direction of excessive caution. When Nolan said something was worth checking, it was always worth checking. He had asked the overnight technical supervisor for a review of the second hydraulic circuit. The supervisor had checked the revised clearance document, the version Grant had authorized, found all systems confirmed normal, and closed the request. Dean had asked twice. The second time, a written response from the compliance office informed him that the concern had been reviewed and dismissed at the senior engineering level, and that further inquiries about the night's clearance documentation should be directed to Grant Vale's office. Dean had gone to the cockpit and run the pre-flight with unusual care. But there was nothing in the instrumentation that morning, sitting on the ground in relatively mild air, that would have told him what Nolan had seen in the simulation data. The aircraft moved onto the runway at 7:03 and lifted at 7:11. The first 4 minutes of the flight were normal in every measurable way, and Grant, standing near the center of the operations center, with both hands in his jacket pockets, said to no one in particular that the morning had answered the question of whether last night's disruption had been necessary. Evelyn did not respond. She was watching the flight display with an expression that had not yet decided what it was. Nolan was standing at the back of the room where Conrad had personally reinstated his access, looking not at the flight display but at the temperature feed and the wind data layered beneath it. The ground temperature at Greyhaven Field had dropped to 23 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, 3 degrees below the threshold he had identified in the simulation, and the crosswind component at altitude was running at 18 knots from the northwest. When the Vantage 900 initiated its first banked turn at 8,000 feet, the pressure sensor in the backup hydraulic circuit transmitted a signal that was 12% outside its calibrated range. The aircraft's monitoring computer received the signal, compared it to the pressure threshold parameters in its safety logic, and classified the backup circuit as experiencing abnormal pressure loss. The isolation protocol engaged automatically, sealing the backup circuit to prevent what the software believed was a developing failure from cascading into the primary system. Simultaneously, a thermal expansion differential in the main circuit's flow regulator, a secondary effect that the simulation had flagged in the third anomaly dataset, caused a momentary flow restriction. Dean felt the control response change before the warning lights appeared. The aircraft was not in immediate danger, but it was handling like a machine that weighed more than it should, and wanted to go where it decided rather than where it was pointed. He reported increased control force to the operations center. The red indicators on the system's display began illuminating in the sequence Nolan had listed in a report that no longer existed as a physical document. Grant said the display was showing a software calibration error, that the aircraft was performing within normal parameters, and that the visual indicators would clear once the system completed its self-diagnostic cycle. Nolan looked at him with the expression of someone who has been waiting patiently for a specific lie to arrive, and then said that software calibration errors did not add weight to a flight control surface. Nolan asked for direct communication with the cockpit. Grant said that was not within his operational authority given that he was no longer part of the command structure. Conrad reached past Grant without making contact, entered his founder's override code into the communications terminal, and handed Nolan the headset. Dean's voice came through immediately, calm but carrying the particular precision of someone who is managing a system that is not quite where it should be. Nolan told him not to attempt a system restart, told him clearly that if both circuits lost power simultaneously during a restart sequence, the aircraft might not have sufficient hydraulic authority to complete recovery. He walked Dean through 5 steps in the order they needed to happen: reduce altitude incrementally and without abrupt control inputs, disengage the auto-trim module, transfer to the mechanical backup control channel that ran independent of the hydraulic sensing array, hold airspeed above the minimum threshold to reduce the load on the primary control surface, and plan an extended final approach rather than a standard pattern entry. Maren Cole, standing against the wall of the operations center with a tablet she had been holding since before the flight began, confirmed for the room. Loudly enough that there was no pretending she had not spoken, that the manual transfer procedure Nolan had just described was part of the aircraft's original design specification and had been removed from the operational manual 18 months earlier on the grounds that it made the documentation appear unnecessarily complex. She said she had the email directing its removal. She said she also had the emails that had preceded it. She did not look at Grant when she said this. She looked at Conrad. Dean executed the sequence. The aircraft's response was not immediate. There was a period of perhaps 40 seconds, during which the flight display showed a deviation that made several people in the operations center stop breathing, but the control authority began to return in stages, and Dean's reports grew incrementally more confident. The remaining problem was the landing. The braking system drew partial authority from the isolated backup hydraulic circuit, and without restoring pressure to that circuit, stopping distance at normal approach speed was going to exceed the runway length available. Nolan asked the ground crew supervisor to mark the full emergency extension and confirm the overrun arrestor system at the far end, not because he expected a hard stop, but because he wanted every available option ready and the crew focused. Then he spent 9 minutes working through a sequence in the aircraft's maintenance interface, a pathway he had built into the system during the original design phase, one that had no entry in the official documentation because he had added it as a last resort option for a failure mode he hoped no one would ever encounter, and he found the valve control override that allowed the monitoring computer to be manually instructed to re-evaluate the circuit it had isolated. Dean entered the code sequence Nolan provided. The backup hydraulic circuit pressure registered, the isolation seal released. Braking authority returned to normal parameters. Dean brought the Vantage 900 down the final approach with the unhurried steadiness of someone who had once trusted a voice on an intercom more than the instruments in front of him, and had been right to do so. The aircraft touched down smoothly, rolled to a stop within the designated zone, and sat still on the runway while the operations center remained completely silent for 4 seconds. Then a technician at the rear of the room exhaled so audibly that 2 people turned to look at her. Evelyn stood at the front of the display wall with both hands at her sides, looking at the flight track on the monitor that showed every step of what had just happened in a sequence she had been warned about in a report she had torn in half the night before. Nolan removed the headset, set it on the console, and did not say anything to anyone. Conrad convened the emergency board session in the conference room adjoining the operations center within 30 minutes of the aircraft stopping. He locked the external communications system, posted a Blackthorne security officer at each door, and told everyone present that the room would not empty until the full factual record of the previous 24 hours had been established. Grant Vail opened his portion of the discussion by suggesting that the morning's event demonstrated a supplier deficiency that no one in the operations chain had been positioned to anticipate, and that the appropriate response was a formal vendor audit, followed by a joint press statement. Nolan said that the sensor's serial number had been modified in the procurement system to make it appear certified, and that the kind of modification required to accomplish that needed executive-level authorization in the purchasing database. Grant said that was a significant allegation to make without documented evidence. Maren set her tablet on the conference table and said she had documented evidence. The emails covered a period of 22 months. The first instructed a procurement officer to substitute a lower-cost sensor from an uncertified supplier and update the inventory record accordingly. The second directed the flight simulation team to exclude from the official test report any scenario results showing irregular hydraulic behavior in cold weather conditions. The third removed the manual hydraulic override procedure from the operations manual on the grounds that simplified documentation produced better first-flight metrics with customers. The fourth revised the pre-flight safety report upward from a conditional hold to a full clearance after Nolan's original version had been submitted. The fifth described, in specific numerical terms, the performance bonus Grant Vail would receive upon execution of the $6.2 billion contract, a figure that exceeded $30 million. All 5 emails carried Grant Vail's name in the sender field. Grant said that Evelyn had approved the overall project timeline and that executive accountability for scheduled decisions rested with the CEO. Evelyn looked at the table for a moment and then looked at Conrad and said that she had not known the specifics of what Grant had done, but that she had created the conditions in which the people around her were afraid to tell her the specifics, and that she understood the difference between the two things was not sufficient to excuse her from responsibility. Conrad asked her, without particular emotion, why she had terminated Nolan without reading his report. She said she had trusted Grant's characterization of it, and she had trusted it in part because she had not wanted to believe that a maintenance engineer in a night shift uniform understood something she did not. She did not dress it up. Conrad said nothing for a moment. Grant, at that point, said that Nolan was a tradesman who had made a fortunate guess about a scenario that was more complex than he was qualified to analyze. Conrad reached into the folder he had brought from the jet, removed a single laminated document, and placed it on the table. It was the original patent filing for the Vantage series hydraulic safety architecture, dated 11 years earlier, and the name in the first line of the co-inventor field was Nolan Reed. Conrad told the room what Nolan had actually done over the previous decade. He described the hydraulic safety architecture that Nolan had designed and that underpinned every aircraft Blackthorne Aviation had produced since the mid-range variant, the same architecture that had allowed the company to pass every major safety audit without a single serious incident for 10 consecutive years. He said that Nolan had declined to accept royalty payments on that architecture, asking instead that the savings be passed to customers in the form of lower certification costs, because he did not want the company's pricing decisions to become a secondary argument for cutting corners. He said that Nolan had been given the authority to suspend any test flight in the company's history if he identified a safety risk that the chain of command was unwilling to address, and that this authority had been written into the company charter not as a courtesy but as a structural safeguard, because Conrad had learned 12 years earlier that the most important voice in an aviation company was not always the loudest one in the room. He told the board that every action taken the previous night, the termination, the access revocation, the classification of the safety report as not requiring review, constituted a violation of the company's founding governance charter, and that the board was now required to respond to it as such. Grant Vail was suspended with immediate effect, his building access revoked, and his personnel file transferred to the Federal Aviation Authority's Investigative Division for review of potential criminal misrepresentation of safety documentation. He left the room without speaking, which was the first honest thing he had done in the building in some time. Evelyn's role as CEO was suspended pending an independent governance review of her decision-making in the preceding 24 hours, with the board noting that her conduct fell short of the fiduciary standard required of a chief executive in matters affecting operational safety. She accepted the suspension without argument. Conrad turned to the assembled directors and said the thing the room would remember. The previous evening, Evelyn had believed that Nolan needed the company in order to keep his family stable. The morning had clarified that the company needed Nolan in order to remain a company. The room was quiet enough that the ventilation system was audible. Nolan, seated at the end of the table nearest the door, did not look satisfied. He looked like someone who had spent the night being proven right about something he had desperately hoped to be wrong about. He said he had one request before the board moved to the next item. He said Blackthorne Aviation should not wait for regulators to identify the scope of the sensor issue. The company should proactively contact every customer currently operating a Blackthorne aircraft with the affected component series, disclose the defect, and initiate replacement at the company's expense without requiring customers to file formal complaints. He said the voluntary disclosure would cost hundreds of millions of dollars. He said it was still less expensive than the alternative. Conrad said he agreed and called for a board vote, and it was unanimous, and that was the end of the meeting. 3 months passed in the way that consequential months do, full of work that is invisible from the outside but that changes the shape of everything when it is done. Every non-conforming sensor in the Blackthorne fleet was identified, documented, and replaced. The company cooperated fully with the federal investigation, providing the unredacted procurement records, the simulation data, and the chain of internal communications that Marin had preserved through the period when she had been asked to preserve nothing at all. Grant Vail was indicted on 4 counts of commercial fraud and 2 counts of falsification of aviation safety documentation, and his legal proceedings moved through the federal system with the methodical patience of a process that does not hurry because it knows where it is going. The $6.2 billion contract was not signed on the morning it was scheduled, but the lead client consortium, after reviewing the company's full disclosure and corrective action plan, reopened negotiations 3 months later under new terms that included an independent safety audit provision, a provision that had not existed in the original deal because Grant had quietly removed it from the draft. Evelyn Blackthorne appeared before the company's assembled workforce on the first Tuesday of the month following the incident, in the main technical center rather than the executive auditorium, standing at a plain podium without a prepared media team and without a prepared statement beyond the one she had written herself. She said she had fired Nolan Reed because she had believed her judgment of his position in the organization was more reliable than his judgment of the aircraft, and that she had been catastrophically wrong, and that the error was hers and not the result of bad information or bad timing or bad luck. She said she was sorry, directly and without qualification, to Nolan, to the flight crew that had landed without full hydraulic authority, to the technical team pressured into silence, and to every person in the company who had watched a safety concern dismissed and concluded that the organization did not want to hear what they knew. She said the apology was not a request for forgiveness. It was a statement of what she intended to hold herself accountable to from that point forward. She looked at Nolan when she delivered the apology and did not look away. Conrad offered Nolan the chief executive role in the weeks that followed, framing it as a natural elevation, given what the board now understood about his contribution to the company's core value. Nolan said he was grateful and meant it, and that he was declining. He said he had no interest in managing quarterly earnings reports or appearing in industry publications, and that he believed he would be a poor CEO in the same way that a very good navigator was a poor cartographer. Related skills, entirely different functions, and it did not serve anyone to confuse them. He said what he would accept was a newly created position, Director of Aviation Safety and Integrity, reporting directly to the board with authority to suspend any program, halt any delivery, or override any contract timeline if the safety basis for proceeding had not been established to his satisfaction, and with the further requirement that his formal objections could not be overruled by any single executive without a full board vote. The board voted to create the position the same afternoon. Evelyn returned to the company 6 months after her suspension, in a role that carried less authority and more proximity to the work that was actually done, overseeing client relations and regulatory affairs, where her ambition and her intelligence were assets rather than liabilities, and where the people around her were experienced enough to push back when pushing back was the right response. She was not the CEO of Blackthorne Aviation, and she spent the first several months finding out that the company functioned better when she was part of a structure rather than the top of one. It was not a comfortable finding, it was a useful one. The second demonstration of the Vantage 900 took place on a clear morning 4 months after the incident, with the full fleet of corrected aircraft, a certified sensor array, and an independent safety observer whose report would be filed with the regulatory authority within 24 hours of the flight. Nolan was not in the guest pavilion and not among the executives on the tarmac. He was in the hangar with the ground technical crew, watching the telemetry feed the same way he watched every aircraft leave the ground, carefully, without ceremony. With the full attention of someone who knows that the distance between a system performing as designed and a system failing in a specific and predictable way is measured in data, and that data does not care who is watching. Conrad found him there, after the aircraft had cleared the pattern and the flight was declared nominal. He asked why Nolan chose to stay in the hangar when there was a perfectly good reception outside with people who very much wanted to express their gratitude to him. Nolan looked at the flight track on the ground display for a moment, where the Vantage 900 was moving cleanly across the screen in the direction it was supposed to go, and said that the people on that aircraft did not need to know the name of the person who had made certain the systems beneath them were functioning the way they were built to function. They only needed to get where they were going and come home. He left the hangar at the end of his shift, precisely on time, to have dinner with his daughter. Behind him, on the wall of the technical center, a new policy statement had been mounted in plain black text on a white board, signed by the board of directors, and witnessed by the safety director and the chief test pilot. No schedule, contract, or executive title shall take precedence over the integrity of a safety determination made in good faith by a qualified engineer. It was not attributed to anyone. It did not need to be.